fundamental issue now before our people can be stated. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule.
Teddy Roosevelt was born as the second of 4 children to Martha Stewart and businessman Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Roosevelt's youth was largely shaped by his poor health and debilitating asthma. He would repeatedly suffer from sudden asthma attacks that caused the experience of being suffocated to death, which terrified him and his parents. Doctors could find no cure. However, young Teddy remained energetic. Roosevelt's father significantly influenced him to shape him to the man he would become. His father was a prominent lead in New York's cultural affairs. He helped to found the Metropolitan Museum of Art and had especially been active in mobilizing the support for the Union during the Civil War. All of these reasons were key in how Roosevelt was able to take in all of these experiences from his father and use them for his own benefit in the future. Roosevelt was mostly homeschooled in his youth by tutors and his parents, with strengths in almost every area besides math and classic language. His father's sudden death on February 9, 1878, devastated Teddy, but he eventually recovered. His father's death helped him to become more motivated in his studies, as well as the want to become an important person in the world someday. After a short term studying natural science at Harvard, he then decided to attend Columbia Law School before moving back into his family's home in New York City. Determined to enter politics, Roosevelt began to attend meetings at Morton Hall, the 59th Street headquarters of New York's 21st District Republican Association. It was here where Roosevelt found allies in the local Republican Party, and with their help, defeated a current Republican state assemblyman. With this victory, Roosevelt decided that politics was for him. Roosevelt was a member of the New York State Assembly in 1882, 1883, and 1884. He immediately began taking action once he got the role, specifically fixing corporate corruption issues. While he ultimately decided to move west for a few years after his term here, Roosevelt was quite aggressive in political nature. Roosevelt returned to the scene in 1886, running for mayor in New York City. And while he failed in winning the election, he decided that he would continue to support Republican candidates for the upcoming elections by giving speeches for them. After William Strong won the 1894 mayoral election, he willingly gave Roosevelt a position on the New York City Police Commissioner's staff, where Roosevelt took action immediately and radically reformed the police force. After his work here, President William McKinley appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. With the beginning of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt resigned from his post to go into battle and lead the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a ragtag group that were outstanding in fighting for our country. After being brought back due to the War Department's fear of yellow fever, Roosevelt was urged to run for New York governor. He won, and it was here where Roosevelt developed principles that later shaped his presidency, including insistence upon public responsibility, publicity as a first remedy for trust, regulation of railroad rates, mediation of the conflict between capital and labor, conservation of natural resources, and the protection of the less fortunate. In November 1899, Vice President Garrett Hobart died of heart failure, leaving an open spot on the 1900 Republican ticket to run with William McKinley. Eager to use Roosevelt's talents, Thomas Platt, a New York senator, began a newspaper campaign in favor of Roosevelt's nomination for the vice presidency. Roosevelt attended the 1900 Republican National Convention as a state delegate and struck a bargain with Platt. Roosevelt would accept the nomination for vice if the convention offered it to him, but would otherwise serve as the New York governor. Roosevelt, in fact, did win the nomination for vice presidency for the Republican Party and ran with William McKinley in the 1900 election. During Roosevelt's campaign, he proved highly energetic in his messages, and he and McKinley proved an equal match for the Democratic presidential nominee, William Jennings Bryan, and his famous barnstorming idea of campaigning. Roosevelt campaigned for himself through criticizing the radicalism of Bryan, comparing it with the heroism of soldiers and sailors who fought and won the war against Spain. This was bad for Bryan because it highlighted the fact that even though Bryan supported the war, he denounced the taking over of the Philippines as imperialism, which subsequently spoiled America's innocence. Roosevelt said that it was best for the Filipinos to have stability and for the Americans to be proud of what they had done. With the nation in a state of peace and prosperity, voters gave McKinley an even larger victory in the presidency over Bryan. After his noteworthy campaign with McKinley, Roosevelt took office as vice president. The office of vice president was powerless and did not suit Roosevelt's aggressive nature. His first 6 months were rather uneventful. However, on September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and subsequently, Theodore Roosevelt himself took office. One of the main things that Roosevelt did as soon as he took office was use the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act to his advantage. The United States at this time was led by big business through individuals such as John Rockefeller in oil and Andrew Carnegie in steel. Roosevelt wanted to get rid of the bad trust that restrained trade and resulted in unfair prices. Subsequently, Roosevelt brought 44 antitrust suits compared to only 18 between the prior presidents Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley. Another thing that Roosevelt did during his first term was regulate railroad rates. Merchants were complaining that they were way too high. Roosevelt and Congress eventually reached a compromise through the Hepburn Act that gave the ICC the power to replace existing rates with reasonable rates. While a large part of Roosevelt's presidency mainly helped the public, some of the work he was most proud of was in pure food conservation. In pure food, he responded to public anger over false advertisements in the food packing industry by passing the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 that banned misleading labels and preservatives that contained harmful chemicals. Perhaps his most empowering move was through conservation. He extensively used executive orders to protect forests and wildlife lands, and he established the United States Forest Service, as well as the creation of bird reserves, national parks, monuments, and much more. Roosevelt issued a total of 1,081 executive orders in his presidency. Just to put that into perspective, the first 25 presidents only issued a total of 1,262. Roosevelt also increased the size of the Navy in his first term and even won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 for his successful efforts in bringing about the Treaty of Portsmouth to end the Russo-Japanese War. One of the more noteworthy events that happened during Roosevelt's presidency was beginning the construction of the Panama Canal. The United States did this because they wanted to establish a canal for maritime trade. Roosevelt was heavily criticized for giving the bankrupt new Panama Canal Company $40 million for the rights and equipment to build the canal. However, the move has proved to be a rather great one, as the canal has connected the Americas together and helped largely with foreign trade too. However, what happened to Teddy Roosevelt was that he almost tried to do too much with his power. As his second term progressed, he continued to try to go for a series of reforms, most of which failed because of the backlash from congressmen and for promising not to go for a third term. Therefore, he was deemed a lame duck for having less influence due to his limited time left. While Roosevelt's time in office was done, it is important to note what happened after his time as president, as the story was long from over. Roosevelt decided that as Secretary of War, William Howard Taft would be his successor, and he actively campaigned for him in the upcoming years. Taft won the 1908 presidential election easily, and while Roosevelt was out of the picture, he attempted in some way to refashion Taft into a younger version of himself. However, once Taft began to display his individuality, Roosevelt did not like that. Roosevelt did not want the Democrats taking control of the presidency, therefore he wanted progressives to take control of the Republican Party in an attempt to save it from being defeated. This ultimately failed, and Roosevelt decided that he would run for election in 1916 against whichever Democrat beat Taft, because he did not want to disrespect the Republican Party. However, once a group of Ohio Republicans nominated Roosevelt for the Republican seat in the 1912 election, he once again gained confidence that he could win the presidency. However, even though Roosevelt was supported by his past, many people still favored his once protege, Taft, instead. Therefore, once defeat seemed probable, Roosevelt formed a new party by the name of the Progressive Party, or Bull Moose. Roosevelt started this with a new nationalism outlook. Some of the issues he wanted to start is to have a minimum wage for women, an 8-hour workday, a social security system, a national health service, a federal securities commission, and a direct election of U.S. senators. Roosevelt's colorful personality helped him overcome the struggles of being a third-party candidate, and he competed fiercely with Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. While Wilson did end up winning, Roosevelt gave him a run for his money and outscored Taft in the popular and electoral votes. This shows that Roosevelt challenged the Republican Party, and this left it discredited for many years to come in the upcoming elections. In addition, although Roosevelt lost the election, much of his new nationalism ideas were enacted during Wilson's presidency. A main reason why I chose Theodore Roosevelt for this project was because he was a president that took action while he was in office and was not afraid to do what he wanted to do. He got things done. Roosevelt used more executive orders than anybody in history, and that just goes to show that he cared about the nation he was living in and wanted to take action to do something about it and make changes. Teddy Roosevelt is remembered for his ability to persuade the public, his energy and excitement, which helped in his persuasion, and his policy of speak softly and carry a big stick as president. Roosevelt did not only so much for the American public, but for the expansion of America's natural resources as well. After the presidency, Roosevelt and his newly formed Progressive Party faded and they rejoined the Republican Party. He actively campaigned for the Republican Party, even though Wilson still won the next election. Roosevelt continued to enjoy the outdoors and hunt until his death on January 6, 1919. The experts of America think quite highly of Roosevelt himself, consistently ranking him upon the upper echelon of presidents in the history of the United States. Roosevelt was honored by being included with Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln on Mount Rushmore, and his legacy in the minds of people is left as a great one.